En el sur de Michigan, en Estados Unidos, entre fines del siglo XIX y principios del XX, un resort dedicado a la salud fundado por John Kellogg, el Battle Creek Sanitarium, y una tesis sobre la geografía de la digestión, biotecnología aplicada a la salud, cómo generó una empresa, la empresa Kellogg. Nicholas Bauch, doctor en geografía por la Universidad de California, nos cuenta en detalle esta historia y las hipótesis que hay detrás acerca de cómo consumimos los alimentos y cómo los digerimos. Ahora, en la repregunta especial. Good afternoon, Nicholas Bauch. Thank you so much for being here today in La Repregunta, el especial.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Nicholas, you have this wonderful book, A Geography of Digestion, full of many, many interesting ideas. What was happening in the end of the 19th century in the south of Michigan in this health house belonged to John Kellogg?
Well, that's a good question to start with. In the south of Michigan, at the end of the 19th century, the book kind of centers on this place called the sanitarium, which, as you said, was a particular building actually that was it was part hospital, part resort, and part kind of educational facility. And people would come there from places all over the world, really. People would come. The majority of people, though, would come from places like New York, and they would get on a train and go to this sanitarium building as a means to seek out health, like bodily health. And one of the primary ways that health was achieved at this place was through the process of digestion, which is how I got interested in this topic of the geography of digestion.
The idea of geography of digestion, what does it mean? Why do you think that thinking of the process of digestion, which is a biological process, does it make sense, or it makes sense to think about it from the geographically point of view?
Yeah, exactly. So when I started getting into the way they were talking about how digestion, their conception, which seems outdated now, I should say, some of the ways they were thinking about how the body works and how medicine works. But I got sort of interested in going into this world of the late 19th century, kind of with the historian's mind, so to speak. And the way they were talking about digestion, I realized that there were many things going on around the body itself, like many technologies and infrastructural things that I started reading and started thinking about them as being related to also what was happening in the health aspects of what was called the Battle Creek Sanitarium. And so we can talk about this more, but a couple of quick examples are, you say, well, digestion, that happens inside of the stomach, that happens in the intestines. But if you look a little closer, you can see, I noticed that they had these machines that they would use to roll out wheat and turn them into flakes. And they would roll out corn and turn them into flakes. And they called those machines pre-digesting machines. So they were part of what they were selling to these people coming from all over the world, was this idea that they had a special, they were selling a particular version of how digestion could happen. And that particular version of how digestion could happen was predicated on this modern technology, the rolling machine, doing the work of the body. So the body didn't have to work as hard. It's important, too, to point out before we go too much further that this sanitarium was the birthplace of the Kellogg's cereal company. Mm-hmm. So when I say cornflakes, I actually mean the cornflakes. This is where what is now a global company, of course, this is how and where it was invented. It comes from this very spiritual, in many ways, like health practice.
It's very interesting, Nicholas, because there are many questions that I want to pose to you. First of all is we tend to think today Silicon Valley as the center of a revolution in technology. Would you say that the Battle Creek Sanitarium was a kind of Silicon Valley applying to the digestion and the food digestion process sector, economic sector in that period, at the end of 19th century?
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting parallel. I guess it's a little bit coincidental, perhaps, that I wrote this book while living in Silicon Valley. Yeah. So I think that is that's a fair comparison or parallel for sure. Well, in terms of right, so the comparison is something like, is this where the technologies of digestion were being invented? And in many ways, yes. I mean, especially when you think of, like you pointed out, the industry part of it. Southern Michigan at that time was in essentially the center of the agricultural economy for mass-produced grains, like I said before, wheat and corn. So they had what like had only recently become, by let's say 1890, what had only recently become a mass-produced commodification of those plants that were available, essentially made those agricultural products very cheap for John Kellogg, who is the person who turned this into a breakfast cereal and these health foods.
Nicholas, it seems very interesting, this answer, because with the idea of the economic sector, in this case, the agricultural sector, which was very strong in that period in many countries, also in Argentina, is that it attached an economy to the exportation of commodities, of land products. But in this case, it is the first step to add technology to this process. It's a value-added economy, this one that John Kellogg is proposing in some way based on the agricultural platform.
Exactly, right. And so, so you add, their business model was to kind of, like you said, take this cheaply available commodity and then repackage it and resell it. Now, interestingly, sometimes, and one thing that they were very good at, the Kellogg company, was literally repackaging. So their the product design of their boxes, some people might be able to imagine that green and red rooster, that's their emblem, became, this sort of iconography of healthy breakfast food, at least in the early 20th century. And they also were very interested in things like wax, they called it like wax tight sealing. Yeah. So it was a way to preserve the cornflakes once they were produced. Whereas, in say the middle of the 19th century, you wouldn't be able to ship those things worldwide. So they had global ambitions from the start. And what I should say, another side story that's really interesting about this is there was a large internal debate at the Kellogg company for a long time about whether or not to add sugar to their breakfast foods and their health foods. And that debate was essentially a religious one. One of the members of the company, John Kellogg, thought that adding sugar would be adulterating the food too much and making it, let's say, quote unquote, less pure. And whereas one of the other brothers, whose name was William, he was the one really with the global ambition. And he said, well, you're going to export more cereal if you add sugar to it.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
but Nicholas, John Kellogg, the founder of this sanitarium, was a doctor in medicine or was an entrepreneur? Which kind of profile did he have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in 19th century terms, his medical training was quite good. He went to a couple different medical schools and ended up getting a degree from the Bellevue Hospital in New York City, which was a highly regarded school at that time, as it is now. And then it's always funny though, because, this is over 100 years ago. So many of the things they did seem sometimes ridiculous compared to what we would think now. But he was a trained medical doctor. Now, what he did with his medical training, he was always controversial in the medical field and always being sort of attacked as being outside of the mainstream. In the book, I certainly don't apologize for John Kellogg's medical practices, but I do find them really interesting and really kind of like a sign of the times of what he was trying to do to bring together systematic nutritional science with his medical training, with his business sense of creating this community of health seeking, basically. Yeah.
You say also that this is a kind of first attempt to develop a biotechnology industry. In which sense do you say this?
Yeah, great question. Well, certainly, so the Kellogg's would probably not, and as far as I know, did not use the term biotechnology, but my reading of it is that they were in fact practicing. One of the terms in the book that I really try to drive home is the idea is that they were extending the body. In other words, they were using technologies placed outside of the body, placed in the sanitarium or placed in the Michigan landscape, that became this network of technological devices and infrastructure that actually impacted the way the body works. So I talked about the rollers. We're rolling out the pre-digesting machine. Another one was that John Kellogg himself was one of the people who brought sewers to the town in Michigan where they lived. So he was very interested in creating this urban infrastructure. And if you think of, sewers is about where does human waste go?
Yeah, it's part of the process of the channel of the chain of digestion. Yeah.
Exactly, right. So it's this very material, very linked connection to agricultural production that was going on in Michigan, eating pre-digested food from the machines of the rollers, and then the human waste that John Kellogg also essentially built for the city to move the human waste stream in different ways than it would have moved before the sewer system.
Well, it's
so he kind of
it's really fascinating, this story of John Kellogg. Was he born in Michigan, or he arrived over there because of this crossover among very different innovations that were happening in the States?
Yeah, so he, I have to remember now, I think he was actually born in New York State. And then he and his family, when he was young, migrated west, what was then, obviously far less populated. So they moved west to Michigan, to this town called the town is called Battle Creek. And they moved there, again, this goes back to the religion part. So his family was extremely religious. They were part of a Christian organization called Seventh-day Adventism. And Seventh-day Adventism was a religious sect that it still exists, but believes in the imminent, like almost immediate return of Christ. So they were a lot, and this is only really important because they were very serious about preparing the body for
the
that
purification of the body.
Exactly. So they were very interested in this like immediate purification of the body for religious reasons, and that's how they were kind of sent to Michigan by this religious sect to set up a camp in Michigan. And then what came out of that was this Battle Creek Sanitarium health resort. Probably not exactly what the church had in mind, but that's what happened.
What is really amazing is that the creation of a new very powerful economic sector like the food sector was the encounter of these different levels of life, religious beliefs on one side, the economic that was being developed in the region, agricultural, the ideas of purification of the body, the interest of this person, John Kellogg, on, getting together all these parts. But what is amazing also is that this creates a paradigm that, has been continued today in terms of how human digestion works. It is outward all over the world, this process, as you described, the geography of digestion.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think, and that's one of the sort of, I think if you read the book and then, if you just kind of sit with it and think about it for a while, I hope that that's one of the things that becomes obvious, is that you can start asking yourself, what are the technologies of my body today? What are the technologies of eating today that directly actually impact materially how our bodies are formed, how they are maintained? So I think a lot of today, I think a lot too in terms of probiotics. So people are thinking a lot about, what kinds of bacteria do I intentionally add to my digestive system in order to make it, quote unquote, work the way it's supposed to work. Interestingly, for John Kellogg, one of his primary motivations was to completely sanitize the inside of the digestive system. So he wanted no bacteria. Every bacteria was bad. So they, part of the reason that flaked cereal became important to Kellogg was that he could bake it in the oven for an extended period of time. And in their philosophy, or in their way of understanding or imagining what was going on, they were imagining that hot temperature of baking these flakes was killing all the bacteria. And then you put it in that sealed box and it comes to you sterile. And then you put that in your mouth and it's sterile food going into, I'm saying all of this from the perspective of the 21st century, looking at this historically. But that's like the model that they were really imagining, and really they would do all kinds of tests for people when they came to the sanitarium. They would pump their stomach and then measure how much acid and bacteria was in their stomach, and then they would try to get rid of those things. Not the best health advice for today. Don't watch this and then try to do that at home.
Nicholas, there's an author that probably Richard Florida from he works for the University of Toronto, who analyzes cities and cities as cluster of creativity. Do you think that as a geographer or specialist who let me rephrase it, as a person who tend to think the phenomenon from the point of view of geography, creativity, because this is a story about digestion, but also it is a story about creativity and business creativity. Do you think that cities are clusters of creation? Was Battle Creek a big city, a cluster of creation? Were there another innovations produced over there?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, it's really interesting. I'd never thought really of comparing those two authors, comparing Richard Florida to the Battle Creek situation. I guess, my instinct is that no, like Battle Creek, it never grew into the kind of urban environment that Richard Florida is talking about. I mean, he's really talking about this idea. I don't know exactly the words that he uses, but when I think of Richard Florida, I think of like synergies of things happen. Like, you have this neighborhood where there's an arts district and that attracts certain kinds of people. And then that arts district
very Jane Jacob ideas, no? These very Jane Jacob
Yeah, exactly. So no, I did not get the sense that was happening in Battle Creek. It remained relatively small, and the sanitarium, in fact, was basically that was the show in town. That's why anyone would go to that town. Aside from, it became a bit of a pilgrimage site for Seventh-day Adventists who would go there, again, for religious reasons.
And it didn't turn into a valley like Silicon Valley, a valley of innovation. No matter it was more rural then, but it didn't turn into a valley of innovation.
Right, it did not go that direction, not Battle Creek specifically. However, if you look to another part of southern Michigan, you could look to Detroit and say that did happen with the auto industry, 30 or 40 years. Like 30 or 40 years after Kellogg, the auto and vehicle car industry in Detroit obviously became huge. That's where Ford and cars and General Motors cars were invented. So that could have been maybe the Silicon Valley of that time. But they're far enough apart. I wouldn't equate Battle Creek with Detroit.
Well, Nicholas, it was really interesting, this story of Kellogg and the geography of digestion. We learned a lot, really. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This is great. I'll do it anytime.
Okay, thank you. Bye.